This game has raised 800 million to date and is yet to deliver even the beta version, despite 12 years of development. What immediately sticks out here is the sentiment of supporters, who view the game not as a failed Kickstarter of epic proportions, but just at the verge of being released, harboring a cult-like following for a game that still doesn't exist. Why are people still donating to the project after 12 years of development without a single playable feature being completed? I had to dive deep into its history to come up with an answer. At first glance, you might think that the game is a scam, either from the very start or gradually over the years. Maybe the developers realized that money keeps coming in as long as the game isn't finished, resulting in a conflict of interest. The reality is much more confusing, however, since not only are they actually working on the game with the sincerest intentions, they actually have been accused of violating labor laws recently by forcing employees to work every day of the week for a month to make deadlines. Star Citizen was promised as a space exploration game with an open universe and realistic spaceship driving, complete with a unique physics engine, real damage to ships that would affect gameplay, and amazing graphics. The man behind the company that would later work on the game is Chris Roberts, who has always been a controversial figure in the gaming industry for over-promising on games, but has a lot of charisma, almost like a cult leader, you might say. When Roberts suggested creating Star Citizen, it gave people what they wanted. To fill a gap that really existed in space games that were lacking a real open-world experience, where the player could travel freely, engage in combat and driving ships with realistic movements. Roberts also convinced fans of his previous games that the time for such a game is now, since the technology to drive it finally exists. After hosting a crowdfunding campaign on their website, they quickly raised $600,000 before the site crashed. The main reason for the immense interest right from the start was mostly because of Chris Roberts, who had a good track record with games like Wing Commander and games he designed like King Kong. Despite having a reputation of over-promising and under-delivering, fans were excited about the potential for Star Citizen and eager to donate when the game was promised to be delivered in just 2 years, with a full release in 2014. When the high demand caused their site to crash, they were contacted by Kickstarter, still in its early days and trying to make a name for itself as a reputable crowdfunding site. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, we know about the risk involved when donating to a game on Kickstarter, but at the time it was still a relatively new thing and enthusiasts of Robert's earlier games were eager to participate. On Kickstarter, they offered multiple award tiers, including the tier for $30, which gave you a full copy of the game upon release, which was likely the first time a lot of people heard of this concept. The game reached their target for $2 million of donations in just 2 days and kept receiving more donations from people that wanted to get their hands on the game early, until the amount of people donated reached 5.5 million. It's crazy to think that a game which as of now burned through $800 million and still isn't playable, started out with the promise of a full game in 2 years for $2 million. One commenter under a Kyra TV video highlighted the absurd amount of time that 12 years are for the development of a game, quote, "things that took less time than Star Citizen's development cycle." No Man's Sky was announced, released, tanked, fixed and released 35 major named updates, and announced a new IP 7 Days to Die, perhaps the longest early access cycle on Steam, released and full released. After raising $5 million, the donations didn't die down and eventually doubled to $10 million that same year. At this point, the studio decided to hold a vote on what to do next since the target was reached fivefold, but the donations and support showed no signs of slowing down. In that vote, they proposed 2 options. Either they keep accepting donations while adding more and more features and stretch goals as long as money keeps coming in, or the second options where they would take the funds raised counter down and calling it mission achieved. Only 5% voted for the latter, with most people voting that the feature list should keep growing as long as the amount of donations is. With the benefit of hindsight, it can be argued that this is one of the main mistakes that created a never-ending cycle of development, having them constantly chasing after the last goal of features while new money keeps coming in just as they catch up to the previous group of new features. Maybe if they had closed off donations then and there and stuck to the original plan for the game, it might have been finished and delivered by now. Either way, the list kept growing with the donations as well as the company itself and the amount of employees, which quickly went from 40 or so to a few hundred. That same year, in 2013, the Hangar module was released alongside 10 patches that fixed the countless known issues and bugs for the open-to-play alpha version, as well as new features, albeit small and mostly decorative ones. It became apparent that this chasing after the ever-growing list of new things to add in the game became a real issue, and articles started popping up accusing the studio of future creep. Still, many people don't believe that this is the reason for the game taking 12 years, 800 million and still not being released. Even though the early access is out and more or less playable, it is very limited in its abilities for the player. The trade mechanics are very limited, with barely anything being available to trade and no real economy. There is also no storyline and feasible progression to follow, just small tasks that one can complete if they ignore the countless bugs. Because of many game-breaking bugs, the company kept increasing the pace, pushing out patches while the amount donated kept rising to the $100 million mark. They were becoming very transparent with their spending, however, posting reports of the amount spent and earned, which alarmingly showed them burning through money as fast as it was coming in. To give people a further incentive to donate or to show gratitude to the people that already did, the Chairman's Club was introduced. Top-tier supporters of the game, starting at $1,000 donated, would get a title as well as a custom skin that displayed the amount of money they donated as a badge of honor in the game. The tiers went as high as $25,000 to get the Legatus Navium title that came with one of the best spaceships in the game, the elusive Origin 600i. Though most titles were mostly cosmetic and didn't give any actual benefit in gameplay, meaning you would donate just for the prestige. In 2016, they demonstrated the current progress at their yearly convention, showing the spaceship landing feature as well as the new parts of the interface. Though it was received positively, with the crowd cheering and sentiment on the subreddit at an all-time high, it was short-lived. By now, the total donations had amounted to 180 mil, a far cry from the original ask of 2 million, which also seemed to be the breaking point for many of the original backers. A year later, in 2017, news articles were mostly criticizing the development of the game, and reputable publishers like Medium started to directly call the game a scam. One article writes, quote, "Star Citizen, which in fact is a scam." No, it may not be that kind of scam, or even a scam in Chris Roberts' mind. Somewhere in his mind, he might believe he will someday deliver on his promises, although many of us doubt it. But it's nonetheless a scam from where I see it. He goes on to highlight many of the frustrations that backers have, despite the progress that was being made, saying, quote, "I backed it July 2013. So 4 years ago we were promised a game that would mix the classic Wing Commander idea with a huge universe. Sounded good. Delay after delay. In 2016, Chris Roberts announced that the original game was to be split in two, Star Citizen and Squadron 42. Early backers, until 2016, would get the two games. In fact, initially promised as one, but newcomers to the money machine that is Star Citizen would have to pay extra for Squadron 42. The quote ends. This version was eventually released and plagued with known issues. People were able to softlock themselves, encountering bugs that made the game unprogressible, not that there was a story. In one bug, you would take the elevator or shuttle to get to a necessary part of the planet before the graphics started becoming jittery according to their own bug report, and you would fall through the floor, losing all health, items and progress. I previously said that the game's Chairman Club doesn't make the game pay to win, since the added benefits for donating are purely cosmetic. Still, the game has been criticized many times and called pay to win, like by some ordinary gamers. Ships start at $50 and go as far as $600, with new concept ships that are promised to be released going as high as $2,000 for an in-game item that's not only necessary, but the whole point of a space simulator. A comment on one of the articles calling the game a scam writes about his experience as an early backer and what he received for it today, quote, "I spent $50 on a starting ship that is basically useless. For some people $50 is nothing, but I think it's a lot of money, especially for a video game, and the only mission that you can do is the PI Wanted mission. Encounter any player who likes to be a pirate and you're fucked as well. Then I thought, maybe there are other missions to have fun. Then I read about Squadron 42, but that also cost $50. The only solution is to spend more money on upgrading your ship to a better ship, which I'm not going to do because eventually I better just keep spending my money just to keep up with everyone else and actually being able to complete a mission fighting the AI." Fast forward 12 years later, the scope of the game still hasn't been defined. I know that people get very passionate and defensive about the game and any critique. And I get it, they donated almost $1 billion. But completing anything is literally impossible if you don't define when it is completed. Obviously, they will never catch up to the list of features if that list keeps growing. A good example on how to avoid feature creep and prevent games taking 12 years for an alpha version is the development of No Man's Sky, also a crowdfunded game. Even though it was a fiasco in itself, the game actually released a playable full version and only then kept adding more features to an already finished game. In contrast, Star Citizen is getting ahead of itself, constantly getting distracted from creating the actual game by other new features. Like the time when virtual reality was getting a lot of hype and Star Citizen decided to implement VR. At the time they got it to work with the interior of the spaceship and promised to keep working on implementing VR into the rest of the game. They would later abandon that idea when the next big hype started. Though 8 years later, they are still promising on their website that it's going to become a thing eventually, even though no progress was made since then. Things are going as always nowadays, except for the previously mentioned allegations of breaking labor laws. They are still in a rush to get the game finished, just like they have been for the last 12 years, meaning it most likely never was a deliberate scam. On some level, I'm sure that Roberts actually believes that the game will get finished someday, and I'm sure the team working on it have good intentions. Either way, unless they finally define the scope of the game and decide what needs to happen for an actual release, it's going to take a long time. Please subscribe to my channel to stay updated. I post every week. Do you think Star Citizen will get released before actual space travel?